The opening variation, called the Torre attack, is not named as you might think after the contemporary Filipino grandmaster Eugenio Torre, but in fact after a Mexican player called Carlos, who was most active in the 1920s, and in fact introduced the opening system at the 1925 Moscow tournament, where he got some notable scalps, including the ex-world champion Emmanuel Lasker. In this video we're going to give you an idea of a reasonable line to play as white against every possible black response to the Torre attack. So it's not really a compendium of everything that can happen, more of a repertoire to give you an idea of what is a good line to every single setup black can come up with. To begin with, we'll look at one of black's sharpest replies, 3c5, and recommend the white response 4e3. Now, the first thing to say is don't, if you have a black in this position, play b6, because it's a very bad move, even though Anatoly Karpov himself played it in his match with Yusupov in London in 1989. It's virtually tantamount to a serious blunder, because the white replies d5. Looks impossible, but the justification is that if he takes d5, knight to c3, black cannot hang on to that pawn. For example, if bishop b7, knight takes on d5, bishop takes on d5, bishop takes on f6, and the problem is that rook in the corner on a8. Black recaptures on f6, white takes on d5, and the point is black cannot in this position take on b2. Let me show you why. If queen takes b2, the threat to the white rook can be dealt with. White plays rook to d1. Now the black knight in the corner can't move because of mate on d7. And if black tries to play some irritating check, like queen b4 check, white can force a win quite simply with c3, exclamation mark. Queen takes c3 check, rook d2. Now the checks are running out, and once again, if black tries to protect the rook by knight c6, there follows queen takes d7 mate. So that trick is the justification for white's strong move, almost a refutation of 4b6 d5. Black is not, of course, obliged to go right down that line we just looked at, but he will have to either cede white a permanent space advantage in the centre because of that pawn at d5, or if he captures, e takes d5, knight c3, after white's inevitable recapture, there will be a weakness on d5 and d6 for black, and a backward d pawn. To show you how difficult black's game rapidly gets after d5, here are a couple of illustrated examples. The game Kovalek-Brunner from 1986. Black played h6. White captured the knight, which will be a frequent response throughout this video survey to h6, I shall observe. Took back with the queen, and then knight to c3. Bishop to b7, e4. So white's lost the bishop pair, but he's got a mighty space advantage in the centre as a very good compensation for that. Brunner went back with queen d8, but after the simple e5, white had a clear space advantage and a very easy to play game indeed. In Yusupov-Karpov from 1989, black played e takes d5, knight to c3, bishop to b7. Yusupov took it. We already know what happens after bishop takes d5. Karpov preferred bishop e7. But after the simple bishop takes f6, black recaptured. c3, white's control of the centre gives him an obvious and simple advantage. Interestingly enough, Tony Miles suggested that in this position black is close to lost. Don't know about that, maybe a bit over the top, but it's certainly a very uphill struggle ahead of him. This game is an example of how a surprise weapon like the Torre attack can have great effect, because Karpov was obviously lulled into a sense of false security, quickly played what seemed the innocuous b6, and rapidly found himself in very serious trouble afterwards. Even the very best make these errors. A far more enterprising move than putting the pawn on b6, and actually a better one too, is to put the queen there for queen b6. Obviously black is going to play quite aggressively now. He immediately sets up an attack on the pawn on b2. Now you can, if you wish, defend that pawn by playing queen c1, but if you do so, you are probably not the most interesting person in the world. We're going to look at a more dynamic continuation for white here, sacrificing that pawn, which is, on the basis of current theory, totally viable and certainly extremely enterprising. After knight to d2, black is not, of course, obliged to take the gambit pawn. He can play, for example, d5. After white captures on f6, you see the first concrete achievement, which is a disruption of the black pawn structure. Black will argue, from his point of view, that he's got the bishop pair now. Recaptures, of course. In my opinion, the most dynamic move here is to play c4, still leaving the gambit pawn there should black take it. The game Plaskett-Hardicai from Stary Smokovets 1982 is, I feel, quite characteristic of the sort of middle games the gambit can lead to. Black taking on d4, white takes back with a pawn, knight to c6, and white really is committed now, trying to defend his pawn is a bit too late, so c takes d5, e takes d5, and simple development with bishop d3. If black now takes the pawn immediately, then white will get compensation after queen to a4 check. Knight must go back to c6, and then castling. There are long-term headaches for black in completing his development and in looking after his somewhat ragged pawn structure. Hardicai preferred not to take the pawn, but to try to complete development for the time being with bishop e6. White castled, bishop d6, rook c1, and he bit the bullet and castled queenside. Here, of course, black doesn't have that one pawn as compensation for its structural deficiencies. Queen a4, king to b8, wise precaution, get off the open file. Knight b3, which is a strategical move, and then it brings the knight towards c5 and protects the d-pawn again. And also an attacking move, looking towards the black king. Black played rook g8, white rook fe1, rook g4. Plaskett here prudently decided to cash in on his structural superiority by forcing the exchange of queens with queen b5. And after rook to g8, took time out to defend the pawn with g3, and quite simply, black doesn't have, I think, 100% compensation for his structural weaknesses here, and white is therefore better. Simple chess, but clear advantage as well. Capturing on d4 really only makes sense, I feel, if black is going to take the pawn next move after white's recapture. So queen takes b2. And once again, white continues in gambit style with bishop d3. There are surprisingly few practical examples of this whole gambit line. Strange, really, considering its critical nature. In the game Yermolinsky-Gama from the 1992 Olympiad, we see white developing kind of classical compensation. d5, castle, knight out to c6, and once again c4. Getting on with it. Having said A, we must say B and keep the initiative. So here, for example, we're black to take on d4, and white should follow up by capturing on d5, and then playing rook b1. Some pawns go west, but he develops a strong initiative, and black is obviously way behind in development. Gama preferred to play queen c3 here, which certainly avoids the queen being harassed by subsequent rook b1, but of course white just played queen e2, and now black has nothing better than taking this pawn on d4. Knight takes knight, queen recaptures, naturally knight to f3 with tempo. Queen went to c5, and white must of course play very aggressively, open up all the lines. He played c takes d5. It's difficult to do concrete analysis here. If you don't have a feel for the initiative, then you perhaps won't feel too much at home on the white side of this position. But it certainly constitutes probably very good compensation for the sacrificed pawns. After queen takes d5, white played bishop c4, the harassed queen went off to a sanctuary on a5. Only now did Yarmolinsky take on f6. Black recaptured, and bishop to b5 with check. Whatever black does now, the initiative is going to persist. If bishop d7, the king will stay in the centre. If king e7, it'll stay in the centre. And the attack is looming. There are 2 pawns as compensation, but it's a very, very dangerous initiative. So the acceptance, queen takes b2. And already there's a major parting of the ways and just to how white should go about trying to find this compensation for the pawn. One idea, been quite popular, is to take on f6. That recaptures, and let's play bishop e2. And white will go fishing around in the murky complications of this middle game, arguing he has play for the pawn. May well be the case. I find it hard to believe that such a quiet line is really the best way of handling it, though. One of the most remarkable treatments, which led to one of the most remarkable games I've ever seen, was from the Manila Interzonal of 1990, with the Chinaman Rong Wang Ye playing white and Grandmaster Murray Chandler of England playing black. White again took on f6, and black recaptured. Instead of bishop e2, he didn't hang about, he went rook b1, trying to gain time by kicking the queen around still further. Chandler took the a pawn. If instead queen c3, then white intended to play bishop d3. If now c takes d4, to castle. And if black were to gorge himself with d takes e3, which I don't think he should do, I think he should prefer to play d5, which will steer us back towards middle game structures we'll be looking at in a moment. If he does take on e3, then the move knight e4, all very much gambit stuff, leads to mighty compensation. E takes f2 with check, rook takes f2, and next move white would capture the f6 pawn with check, and his entire army is on the field and black lags terribly in development. This is real classical and strong compensation for the material. Chandler played the critical capture on a2, and the Chinaman played knight c4. Before going into these complications after this move, it's worth looking at the alternative of bishop c4, which has been recommended. I've been unable to find any practical examples. And after the queen moves to, let's say, a5 or a4, to follow it with d5. 2 clear pawns down, but a big development lead, and obviously black is extremely gummed up here. Shamkovich has suggested that after a6, intending b5 of course, rook a1, queen c7, white castles, black can play the ingenious move b5, which white takes because of the pin, and then black plays bishop b7, gaining time because now of the threat to the bishop on b5. Here he thinks the game is unclear. I'm not certain. It's certainly very, very interesting, and it's a shame no one's ever played it. Well, knight c4 was played, the point being that white now threatens to trap the queen with rook a1, and so the only move is queen a4. And now, as you might expect, white played d5, this time with a knight on c4 rather than a bishop. Well, taking on d5 is really very dangerous indeed for black. After white's recapture, he's getting an awful lot of important central squares, and if queen takes c2, black is a full 3 pawns up, but after bishop d3, queen check, maybe now king e2 or even knight from f3 to d2, white has enormous and classical compensation. Chandler's play is much more in the spirit of things. He went b5, counter-attacking. White could now play rook takes b5, the point being that if black captures it, knight d6 check wins the queen. But the intended reply to that was bishop a6. And the rook can't retreat because of the attack on the knight on c4. Therefore, the only way to get out of trouble is to play knight to b2, as you might imagine. Knight on b2 isn't very well placed. And after queen e4, black is getting the advantage. So Wang retreated with knight to d2. And now Chandler played the plausible move ae6. I'm not sure it's the best. We get some more critical positions after black takes on d5. White would then recapture, probably with a bishop on b5. Very hard to assess what's going on here. Or alternatively, black might advance with pawn to c4, thereby protecting his b5 pawn and opening his dark square bishop's path into the game. Perhaps white's best here is to play knight d4, with splendid and very murky complications. After a6, white played rook a1, and the harassed queen went to b4. If it moved to any other square, white could have taken the pawn on b5, of course, because of the pin. And now c4. It's not meant as a ratios comment, but this is in some ways unmistakably the game of a Chinaman. Chinese chess is, of course, quite different to Western chess, and it's very, very popular over there, and most of their chess players, got some strong grandmasters, also play Chinese chess, and their thinking does seem to be slightly different to Western concepts. This is one of the most interesting games of modern times, in my opinion. Chandler played bishop b7, and white kept the bind with e4, still 2 pawns down. Murray sought development with bishop g7, rook b1, queen a5. Now white could have cashed in by taking on e6, then taking on b5, getting one of his pawns back and keeping a development advantage. But he played just bishop d3, very restrained. Chandler tried to get back home, queen c7. And here again, white didn't want to take on e6 and b5, getting the material back, he just castled. So Chandler cemented his 2-pawn advantage with b4. White went knight to h4, opening up pathways for his queen, also for the f-pawn. a5, obviously this pawn has to be stopped before it gets to a4, so bishop c2 was played. Again, bishop h6. And now another remarkable concept, bishop a4. That's not so strange, holding up the pawns and pinning the d-pawn. Chandler went queen f4. And you would have thought here that white would have taken time out to connect his knights, thereby avoiding the capture of one of them. But in fact took on e6. Very, very original chess. Well, the proper discussion of the opening is behind us now. Suffice to say that if black takes on d2, white follows up with queen h5, with a great compensation for his material. As you can see, black has a lot of difficulties moving his clogged up pieces around. Or alternatively, if he takes the other knight on h4, Wang reasons that by taking on d7 with check he gets a lot of compensation. For example, king d8, knight to b3, then take the knight to c5 or the queen to d6. Queen takes e4, for example, threatening mate, then f3, simply. Bishop in with check, king out of the way of course, queen to e7, rook e1, and the initiative keeps rolling. Very, very unusual thinking. Well, for the rest of this amazing game, I would refer you to the accompanying booklet. I don't think all the questions are answered by it about this interesting double pawn sacrifice, but it may well be viable on the basis of this one practical example. It's safe to say the most usual move in this position is bishop to d3. Continuing developing as rapidly as possible, preparing to castle. The most usual reply now is d5, which obviously has the irritant threat of going c4, sometimes pushing the bishop back. Bishop takes f6 is usually seen. One move black doesn't have to think about. G takes f6. And now c4, leading to gambit play very characteristic of this variation. One of the most recent games in this line was played between the American Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky and a machine called Hierarchs Master 3.0 at the 5th Harvard Cup in October 1994, a human versus computer event. Well, maybe this game shows out some of the shortcomings of machines in their inability to probe and to assess the problems of long-term weaknesses, because Hierarchs now took on d4, might recaptured. It took on c4, opening the game up as rapidly as possible. Right, took back with the bishop. And Black's next move is probably dubious. He played bishop to h6. It certainly facilitates development quite rapidly, but after castles, just look how quickly White whipped up an attack against the unsuspecting computer. Black also castled. Knight to e4, first threat. Knight d7. White gained time to bring his rook into the game with rook b1. Only one move in reply. Queen a3. And now, very simple, d5. And defence is not easy for Black. If the knight moves to b6, the f6 pawn falls with check. Meanwhile, capture on e6 is threatened. Taking on d5 will just allow White to bring his queen into very aggressive position with queen takes d5 immediately, following up with queen h5 and rook e1, knight d6. These sort of moves, the attack is very strong. So instead of that, Hierarchs tried to defend with e5, but it could well be its position is already lost because Yermolinsky played the simplest moves and crushed it. Knight to h4, opening up the path to f5 for the knight, h5 for the queen, b3 to g3 for the rook. It's probably already gone, this position. Knight b6, more than one way to skin a cat now, but Yermolinsky chose queen h5, bishop g7, rook b3 with tempo, queen a4, rook g3, threatening mate, king h8, bishop d3, and the hapless Black king with just one bishop defending it and 5 white pieces attacking it has already gone. Black played f5, knight g5, now it tried to defend with queen takes h4, but unsurprisingly it lost a few moves later. By far the most common 8th move for Black here has been queen c3. The argument is the queen's got to go back sometime, and so it might as well cause some disruption en route. Well, how to cope with the threat to the bishop? The move king e2 I've been unable to find any practical examples of, but it's certainly well worth considering. White forfeits castling rights, but he can quickly get a rook to c1 with tempo, and he doesn't have to retreat his bishop, which he'll have to do if he doesn't play king e2. The alternative seems to be bishop back to e2. And to show you how dangerous the white initiative can become, here's the game Salov de la Villa from the 1987 Chirac Interzonal. Black took on d4, much like the machine just did in the previous game. But it's a bit dangerous. Rook c1 with tempo, queen to a5, c takes d5 with tempo, threat to the bishop on c8, knight a6 to counter that threat, knight takes d4, queen takes d5, castles. And of course there are many ways Black can try to get his act together here, but I think what actually happened is representative of the kind of initiative White can develop. Bishop e7, bishop f3, queen d7, now comes a nice disruptive move, knight c6, which can't be taken of course because the recapture of the bishop wins the queen. Black castled, queen e2, still the knight is immune because White will capture the rook in the corner with his bishop. So Black tried knight b4, do something about the congestion. White took that off. Black recaptured. White knight came to e4. Rather a simple threat, which Black spotted. Bishop back to e7. And now rook fd1. This is classical compensation for a pawn. Massive development lead. Queen e8, and White could have tried various ways of continuing from here. Maybe queen b2. He in fact tried rook c7. It's very hard for Black to get developed at all. e5 is trying to find a way out for his queen's bishop. But the simple retreat knight g3 sets up a very strong attack based upon the idea of bishop e4, queen out to h5. To do something about that, De La Villa played bishop d8, hoping to evict the rook from c7. A very elegant combination finished things off. Rook takes c8, more of a positional sacrifice really, total domination of the light squares here. Black recaptured, now bishop e4 all the same, with the same threats, but in exchange less. f5, as you can see, was the only way of stopping that queen coming to g4 or h5. White took with a knight. Still now queen g4 check and mate is threatened, so king h8 to get out of the way. And the simple knight d6 is murderous. Forking queen and rook, black played queen e6, and bishop f5 wins a piece and ended the game. In an earlier game, Vaganyan vs Razavayev from Moscow in 1983, black chose to capture the c-pawn. White castled, and due to the fact black must skedaddle sometime with the queen, he chose to do it now, queen a5. Knight takes c4, queen back to c7. And white of course keeps developing to make the most of his initiative. Rook c1, knight c6. Well, here Vaganyan actually continued with the move knight from c4 to d2. And after bishop to e7, which is what Razavayev played, perhaps the simplest way to play for white then was to take on c5. From here, white might intend to follow up with knight b3, or perhaps knight e4 to d6. But he suggested that e4 might have been a better move. The idea was obviously to follow up with d5. So c takes on d4, knight takes on d4, and white has an initiative, obviously threatening knight b5 to d6 if he can. Vaganyan suggested maybe a6 here, and then interesting continuation, knight takes c6, damaging the black pawn structure, but b takes c6. Now the really interesting move, e4 to e5. And after black captures to follow up with maybe bishop f3, maybe rook e1, maybe bishop h5, and keep going with the initiative. In the game between Joel Benjamin and Walter Brown from the Philadelphia Open of 1993, a new move was tried here. Benjamin put the bishop back to c2, which nobody thought of before. After knight c6, in fact this position was reached by transposition, white played c takes d5, e takes d5, now he took on c5. Black took back with his bishop, white castled. Black developed his bishop to e6, rook to c1, queen to a3, knight to b3 with tempo, bishop back to b6, knight to d4. Now clearly if black were to capture on a2, bishop a4 comes with great pressure, so black took on d4, white took back with his knight, and after king e7, which is as good a way of developing as any, clearly castles isn't very strong there because the reply queen h5 is devastating. This is certainly one point of Joel Benjamin's idea of keeping the bishop on the b1 to h7 diagonal. It deters black from castling for a while. Benjamin played bishop b3, just tidying up his position. Well, in fact this game was drawn after about 55 moves. Black could not find a way of getting his game together sufficiently to exploit his extra pawn. In fact, white had quite a strong initiative throughout most of the middle game. He couldn't actually translate it into anything positive, but it was certainly sufficiently irritating to prevent black, as I say, from cashing in on his extra material, and white easily held the balance. So maybe we'll be seeing this retreat to bishop to c2 again in future. To return to the position then after 6 bishop d3, d5 isn't the only move, knight c6 has been tried. The game Sokolov-Georgiev, white certainly made the gambit look very good value. He castled. This is from a tournament in Palma de Mallorca, 1989. Speaking of Ivan Sokolov, black played now d5. If he takes on d4, the attack can get pretty strong quite quickly. Knight c4 with tempo. Queen b4. We follow the game of Cambridge Bonin from Philadelphia, 1985. Rook b1, queen a4, e takes d4, White has reasonable compensation with the black queen a bit offside and white's development lead and open lines for his pieces. So 7d5 was played. Sokolov took the knight, and we get, after g takes f6, c4, a familiar type of structure. Well, Georgiev tried an unusual way of getting his act together from here. He played knight b4. Very ambitious. Back to e2 this time, went Sokolov. Queen a3, and now white tried to open up lines as fast as possible. He could have taken twice on d5 and then c5. He played the very interesting move e4, however. Black took it off. White took back. Once again we see the knight coming to e4 with tempo. Bishop to e7, and queen d2 is a sensible move, developing the queen to a dark square. Georgiev developed with bishop d7. Sokolov could now take him with a pawn on c5 with quite a nice position. He played even more ambitiously with queen f4. Black castled queenside, which is really the only consistent move after all his grandiose manoeuvrings with his knight and queen over there. And once again, taking on c5 isn't bad here, but knight takes f6 was played. C takes d4. Knight takes d4. Knight going towards the action zone on the queen side. Bishop c6. Knight b5. Brings the knight towards the action zone with tempo. Queen a5. And now occurred a very clever tactic indeed. Knight e4. Threatening a check on d6, of course, so Sokolov found Georgiev had taken it with bishop takes e4. And see if you can guess white's next move. He didn't take back, he played queen takes f7. Notoriously weak square f7 tactically, but one would have thought it was doing quite well there for black, but queen takes f7 turns out to be a very strong move indeed. Not only is the bishop on e7 hanging, but the one on e4 is also hanging to queen takes e6 with check, so rook d7 is the only way to avoid that. But after queen takes e6, the point is white will soon be following up with bishop g4, causing a lot of tactical problems for black. Bishop's on pre, so back to c6 it goes. And now bishop g4. Note the complete lack of coordination between black's queenside pieces in particular. h5, but of course white just dropped it back to h3, keeping the pin on. Bishop to d8, trying to wriggle out. Rook a d1, rook h7. Now a very elegant, simple move a3. Now play should probably have gone knight to a6. And white can finish off the attack with knight takes a7 check, king c7, knight takes c6. But in fact, black moved the attack knight to c2, but after queen g6, not only is the knight attacked, the rook on h7 is also attacked due to the pin on the d7 rook, and after rook e7, black is totally lost. Queen takes knight. He could have resigned here. In fact, played a6, and the final elegant move of a very nice attack was knight a7 check, after which Georgiev resigned. I think these games give you an indication of what kind of play white gets for the pawn in this gambit. Long-term compensation, more active piece play, development lead, and as we saw for example in the Benjamin Brown game, even when black gets his act relatively speaking together, these long-term positional weaknesses, f6, f7, d5, h7, are difficult liabilities for him to defend adequately. Perhaps the most classical responses to the Torre attack are where black plays some combination of c5, d5 and b6 fianchetting his queen's bishop. This is a game between Yasser Serouan and Wolf Anderson from 1989. c5, e3, bishop e7. Just quite development for the time being. Knight to d2, b6, c3, the characteristic bolstering of the centre, by contrast with c2 to c4, which is often seen in the Queen's Gambit declined or the Queen's Indian defences. All fianchettoed. There comes the bishop to d3, knight c6. Now the significance of white's next move, a3, is that he wants to play e4 and avoid the problem of black taking on d4 and then going knight b4, harassing his bishop. Well, at this point, Anderson castled. And it may seem strange to call such a natural move an error, but it really is something of a serious inaccuracy, because after e4, Sir Ryan had a slight but enduring spatial advantage in the middle, for which black didn't have all that much compensation, really. d6, and now by comparison with move 8, where he played e3, Sir Ryan now played h3, once again to avoid any harassment of his bishop, this time after it comes back to e3. Anderson exchanged in the centre and played e5. He's very much a defensive player, Ulf. Especially with the black pieces. After d5, knight b8, he's quite happy to crouch here with less space, but argue that it's hard for white to win. Indeed it is, but after bishop e3, knight d7, b4, we can end our analysis of the opening and conclude that with more space on the queen side and the black queen bishop completely asleep on b7, black hasn't really equalised out of this opening. One of the most dangerous practitioners in the world of supposedly quiet queen pawn openings is Vlado Kovacevic of what used to be Yugoslavia, probably Serbia now. Here's an example of him punishing another inaccurate castling move order from black. His game with Dragoljev Minutes from Karlovac 1977. c5, e3, bishop e7. Nice quiet build-up, knight d2, b6, c3, bishop d7, bishop d3. Here we just saw Anderson play knight c6. Minutes exchange in the centre. One of the fundamental themes of the Torre attack is whether to recapture with the e-pawn or the c. As you might imagine, the symmetrical positions after c takes d4 aren't quite as interesting as those after the recapture with the e-pawn, which Kovacevic played. And now black castled. Seems hard to call this a bad move. And if you're not familiar with the Torre attack or this game, you might want to turn off at this point and see if you can guess white's reply. He played knight h4. I did something similar when Tibor Karolyi also castled too quickly in the Torre attack as black against me in the Student Olympiad of 1981 in Graz, and afterwards the American Grandmaster Joel Benjamin came up to me and asked me if I was crazy. I said, well, maybe, but I don't think h4 was the evidence for that. It's actually quite a sound move and showed in one or two Kovacevic games, after which he too became convinced of its efficacy. Well, black now played knight e8, which is a move suggesting panic. If instead, for example, something rational like d6, white can make sense of his attacking stance, which the last move suggested. For example, bishop takes f6, very interesting concept. Giving up the bishop after bishop takes f6 in reply. Queen c2. And if h6, then white can castle queenside, follow it rapidly with g4, g5. If g6 and h5, and already the threat of a sacrifice on g6 is looming, white will again castle queenside and use the open files on the king side for an attack. After the rather weedy knight e8, Kovacevic's game didn't hang about. Having played h4 last move, it was g4 this one. And the plan is, of course, queen c2, castle queenside, get on with it. So Minutes tried to hold things up with f5. It would be interesting to know what the clock times were at this point. Of course, Vlado took it, opening up the g file. Black took back. Check on b3 to speed up development. King in the corner. Now castling queenside. So this is after 13 moves of what is supposed to be a quiet opening. You can't get many more violent situations after 13 moves from any opening. Knight d6 played black, but it's clear that his plan of knight e8 and f5 is already not working out at all. And castling may have been a very serious mistake indeed. Rook from d1 to e1. The point of this move is that black must now play a move he doesn't really want to play, which is to take on g5. If bishop f6, then the move queen a3 is totally crossing up his position. So he took on g5, and of course Kovacevic recaptured with the h-pawn. Tremendous threats down the h-file. g6 played Minutes trying to shore things up. d5 is a very clever interference move. The point now being that black can't play knight a6 because white takes and then plays queen a3, winning one of the two attacked minor pieces. Black's position is a bit of a wreck here. He may already be lost. He went king g8. Kvatsovich brought his queen into the action zone with tempo. Queen b4, knight f7, queen h4, h6, rook e to g1, with terrible threats. I mean, it's bailed out, taking this pawn on d5, but after queen d4, since White's next move will be either queen takes bishop or g takes h6, with a crushing mating attack, he resigned. If Black is going to play a classical formation with d5 and c5, then frequently the move order is not all that crucial. But the timing of castling, as you've just seen in those illustrative games, can be. Here's another example of Black not getting it right. From 1949, Petrosian versus Lubinsky. c5, e3, bishop e7, knight d2, and this time Black advanced the d-pawn before fianchettoing. c3, knight d7, bishop d3. Castles. A move Petrosian didn't like. He preferred either b6, which is very much a main line of the Torre, or queen c7, to prevent the intrusion of the knight on e5 completely. Because after castling, the most natural moves have to be very effective. Knight e5. Black took this knight. If he doesn't, or actually if she doesn't, from the game Polyranaide versus Hunt from the Rio de Janeiro Zonal of 1979, and the only pronunciation I'm confident about there was Rio de Janeiro, queen c7 was played. The simplest move, f4, builds up a classical stonewall attack. In a few moves, White launched a very, very powerful initiative. b6, castles, a5, hoping to play bishop a6 and trade off the light squared bishops, but rook f3 is very simple and extremely effective. Bishop a6, of course, White wants to keep her bishop for attacking purposes. Black played rook e8. After rook h3, g6, White simply went queen e1 to h4 with a fearsome attack and hardly any counterplay at all for Black. And if in this position h6, one simple plan is just to take the knight and then play f4 with another powerful attack along similar lines to the one just seen. So Lubinsky took on e5 and then dropped back to d7. And Petrosian instructively played bishop to f4, avoiding the exchange. In the particular position it's hard for Black to play f6 now, because after queen h5 the roof of his kingside is caving in, and if g6 is a very powerful sacrifice of the bishop. Let's recapture. Queen check. White now has a forced draw if he wants it, but by continuing with h4 and a kingside build-up, his threats are likely to be overwhelming. In view of that, Lubinsky tried to close the kingside up completely with f5. But Petrosian was one of the best blockading players ever, at h4. And after c4, which doesn't really help Black very much, drop the bishop back of course to c2. b5, knight f3, he has a lovely square at d4 for this knight, plus a kingside attack and a blockade. Knight c5, g4. The most dangerous pawn to take after the reply knight g5. The attack is very strong. So Lubinsky tried to complicate matters with b4, which doesn't do very much really, it's just a red herring. And here the strongest move for White was just knight to d4, with a complete blockade and a very comfortable middle game, and the attack on the kingside still going. Well, having mentioned how strong the move knight e5 was in this position, I want to give a further generic plug to White's attacking chances by pointing out the game Dreyev-Pavlovich from 1988, where White in fact castled, which is I think not as good, because Black could now put the stoppers on knight e5 by playing queen c7 for example, or maybe even knight e8. But he carried on playing classically with b6, and after knight e5, Once again, f4 is looming for a build-up. Bishop b7 was played to complete the development and of course to stop the fork on c6. f4. Very logical, very simple. Probably the best now for black is to play knight e4 to defuse the white attack. But in fact took time out to play a6, which isn't very productive in this position at all. And after rook f3, he now thought he could play knight e4, but there are some differences. White exchanged on e7. And played rook h3, familiar manoeuvre. And if now, for example, the knight from d7 goes to f6, then there's no reason not to let it all roll with g4. A nice build-up. So instead, black chose f6. And it looks as though he's achieved quite an important strategical objective. We've been going on and on about how effective this knight on e5 was as a basis for attack. But unfortunately, there is a tactic in this position which he overlooked. Knight takes on d7. Queen takes on d7. Pawn takes c5. Black recaptured with the pawn. Now a very elegant way of achieving a positional advantage. Rook takes h7. The point being that after king takes, knight takes e4. Black cannot take on e4, of course, because the bishop takes e4 check and queen takes on d7. So he must move his king out of the firing line. And now after knight takes c5, white has a clear advantage with two healthy pawns for the exchange and a dark square blockade. He stands clearly better and went on to win. So the attacking build-up with knight e5 after black has castled is a real menace. So principal is the intrusion of a knight at e5 after black has played d5, that he has to be quite accurate in his move order. In this position, b6, deferring castling, and bearing in mind very much the possibility of later castling queenside, is probably a better move. After knight e5, exchanging on e5 is almost forced. Even so, greater player as Viswanathan Anand misjudged this position in his game against the German Grandmaster Moore in Belgrade, 1988, and played bishop b7. And after f4, black again casually castled, thinking that the Torre attack is a quiet opening, there's no need to be so careful about move order. Queen f3, h6, quite accurately played, h4, intending a sort of a pawn storm with playing a subsequent bishop takes f6 and g4, g5. Black is already under real pressure here. He played knight e8 and Moore played very imaginatively. Bishop takes h6, very strong sacrifice. Pawn takes bishop, queen h5. And I'm trying to keep things closed with f5, but after g4, white determinedly opened them up again. Knight g7, queen takes h6, rook f6, knight g6, and the attack ploughs on. I refer you to the accompanying booklet for the remaining moves of this game, but it's just another example of black relaxing and white blowing him away. Taking on e5 is better, possibly even mandatory. After recapture, knight d7. White achieves little with bishop f4, black can even consider playing g5 and h5 after that. So, once again, an exchange on e7. Now f4 to cement this pawn. This is a very characteristic middle game formation indeed, arising from the Torre attack. After the examples you've seen, you'll follow that black is in no hurry to castle kingside, but far more often will castle queenside. So if you look at bishop b7, castles, f6 to challenge this spearhead, pawn takes on f6. We have a kind of situation which has arisen many times in Torre attack middle games in the past 20 or 30 years. For example, g takes f6, e4, castles queenside, certainly a safer spot than the kingside, queen e2. It's difficult to say for certain who has the better chances here. In the game Boris Spassky versus Andrei Sokolov from Begonia 1986, black continued with d4. a4. The theme is clear, a5 is looming. Possibly exchange off the light squared bishops, play for an attack against the black king. This game was drawn after many adventures. There are of course plenty of black setups which obviate the establishment of a white knight on e5. Consider the game Timon Belyaski from Viscount's A 1985. Knight c6, this time, not to d7, bishop d3, and having seen some of the debacles that have befallen black after a knight getting to e5, you understand Belyaski's next move very clearly. He played knight d7. Obviously the bishops were exchanged, and Timon castled. This is not quite as innocuous a position as you might think. Black also castled. Now a very perceptive move indeed, rook e1. And the fact is that having the queen vis-a-vis the rook on the same file can cause a few tactical problems. For example, e5 looks very comfortable, but is met by e4. And black has some problems, but how to defend against the threat of e takes d5. That explains why Belyaski slipped the queen to f6. But Timon made the most of his chances. He went bishop b5, and a recurrent idea now is to try and get a sort of good knight versus bad bishop, or slightly better knight versus slightly worse bishop, middle game. So now, for example, if e5, white would take on c6, black must double his pawns in reply, and then white could capture twice on e5 and stand slightly better structurally. Well, Belyaski's a strong grandmaster, but he was fishing around a bit here. He played queen d8, and this sort of loss of time should probably have been exploited, in my opinion, not by rook c1, as Timon played, even though he won the game, but by pawn takes on c5, trying to open up lines as fast as possible to exploit a development lead, which is, after all, a classical strategical idea. Black recaptures on c5, of course, b4, knight d7, e4, with a small plus for white. Well, perhaps prompted by that experience, 8 years later, Alexander Belyaski, when playing black against Vladimir Malanyuk, tried a different plan. From here, 3 bishop e7 he played, knight d2, d5, e3, c5, c3, queen b6. The same flank attack we saw early on in the video, but here a little later. His idea is simple. After rook b1 to defend the pawn, bishop d7. An idea sometimes seen in the French defence, the advanced variation. The idea is to exchange off this bad bishop by playing it to b5. Well, he certainly made the idea work. In the actual game from here, Malanyuk played knight e5. Belyaski took on d4. White played c takes d4. But after bishop b5, Belyaski's idea was completely vindicated. He's got rid of his only problem piece. In fact, Malanyuk could find nothing better than bishop takes check. Queen takes b5, queen e2. But black simply exchanged queens and played knight from f6 to d7, and the game was totally equal, even though white did eventually win after some further errors. In my opinion, a far more testing challenge to this new strategical theme of playing the bishop out to b5 was, instead of 8 knight e5, to play 8 bishop d3. And if black continues as he did with c takes d4, to take back with the e-pawn, intending to play queen e2 next move, to totally thwart any ideas of bishop b5. If here bishop b5, I would suggest bishop to c2. When white threatens to play a4 and b4, drowning out the bishop, and allowing himself the possibility to castle. Another possibility is to play b3 and c4. But either way, I think this is probably going to be certainly a very good idea, and close to a refutation of black's idea of bishop d7 to b5. One of the most solid replies to the Torre attack is to fianchetto the queen's bishop with b6 and then play c5, as we've already seen, but for the time being to withhold the advance of the d-pawn. So, for example, 3c5, e3, bishop e7, knight d2, knight c6, c3, b6, bishop d3, castles. No great danger of a knight becoming established on e5 now, since we have the pawn which can go to d6 to control that square. After, for example, white castles, exchanging on d4 was one of the fundamental points of this setup for black. Taking back with the c pawn leads to a symmetrical and rather sterile position, so taking back with the e pawn is a way to keep some play. And the next move is most noteworthy. Knight d5. This exchanging idea was first played, I believe, by Capablanca, who knew something about strategy. And the point is that black relieves some of the pressure on his position. He's got less space, so piece exchanges tend to help him. And this is regarded as one of the most effective ways of going towards an equal middle game. White, of course, exchanges on e7. The best recaptures with the knight from c6 here. After rook e1, bishop b7, bishop f1 is a sensible regrouping move. This is a very characteristic middle game arising from the c takes d4 and knight d5 plan. After f5, chances are about equal. White can hope to probe away on the queen's side with c3, c4, but black has a very solid position. So effective is this simplifying manoeuvre for black that whites have attempted to meet it head-on. So, for example, from this position, 7, c takes d4, 8, e takes d4, d6. Before giving black the chance to play knight d5, some people have locked that knight off. Consider bishop takes f6. Black recaptures with the bishop. Queen c2. h6 to defend the pawn. Bishop e4. Queen c8. Castles queenside. Knight d7. Rook h to e1. This is the game Barlov versus Vlado Kovacevic from Switzerland in 1989. This time Vlado is on the receiving end, the black side of a Torre attack. He tried b5 after bishop takes on b7. Black recaptures. The ingenious d5, after which, of course, queen takes d5 is met with knight e4 with a strong attack. So black tried to keep lines closed with e5. White played knight e4 with a dangerous attack. If, for example, now bishop e7, then now comes the pretty move knight to d4, and this knight is heading towards f5 or c6, and it can't be taken, of course, because after e takes d4, knight takes d6 check wins the black queen. Therefore, Vlado preferred to castle, leaving his d pawn on prise, but Barlov, I think, rightly ignored it and played g4, playing for the attack to blast open lines on the king's side. It's a race position, opposite sides castling, opposite sides attacks, but there's no doubt that white is the clear favourite amongst the bookies to get first here. Let's take a further look at this plan of taking off that knight in f6. Bishop takes f6. Bishop recaptures. In a game between Serouan and Korchnoi from a Rapids tournament from 1992, Yasser did not play queen c2, as did Dragan Barlov. He played bishop e4 immediately. Now d5, and of course we go back where we came from, and try and use the e5 square later on. So Korchnoi took it on e4. Recaptures. Now d5 was played. Knight takes bishop check, and if queen takes knight, then queen to a4 check will force black to either run into a pin after knight d7, knight e5, or if not knight d7, then he must move his king, forfeiting castling rights. So Korchnoi took back with a pawn, and after queen to d2, he castled kingside, and Serouan played the alert move g4. No clues as to what his middle game plan is going to be. Knight d7, h4, king h8. Once again we see white castling queenside on the white side of a Torre attack. Rook g8, g5, rook c8, king b1, queen e7, rook h g1, rook g7. White now built up a force in the g file and ended up with a clear strategic advantage. There's one final commentary upon this plan of bishop taking on f6, followed up this time by bishop e4. We would draw your attention to the appended game Miles Kasparov from 1994, where even the greatest player of all time found himself getting into an objectively inferior position in response to this plan. Some time ago we showed you the game between Ivan Sokolov and Kirill Georgiev from 1989, which was a crushing victory for white, in the line where black plays an early queen b6. In the same year, the same players met again. This position arose, identical to the ones we've been looking at, except for the interpolation of the moves h6, bishop h4. And Kirill Georgiev took on d4. Note the black knight is now on c6, so the maneuver bishop takes f6 is all the more effective because black cannot take back with a knight, thereby bringing another piece to defend his kingside. After bishop takes f6, e takes d4, black castled. Though it's not quite a case of castling into it, which we've seen earlier on, it is an opportunity for white to get a nice build-up. Watch this, knight e4, bishop e7, knight g3. I preface, of course, to bringing pieces towards the black kingside. d5. This move cedes white a lot of control of the square e5, but the problem is that the more restrained move d6 runs into queen e2, and white is already threatening to exploit the weakening of the b1 h7 diagonal by going queen e4, provoking further weaknesses on the black kingside. And therefore, d5. And this game continued. Queen e2, bishop d6, rook a e1, rook c8, king h1, an all-purpose preparatory move for action on the king's side, bishop f4, this didn't turn out particularly useful, knight h5 with tempo now, bishop back to b8, and the familiar deployment of a knight at e5. Of course, white wants to play f4 and build up on the king's side. So Georgiev took it off, seeking counterplay before white in 2 or 3 moves will build up a very powerful attack, and the move d4 is entirely consequent to get going. Well, Sokolov continued very energetically with f4, which now has the crushing threat of queen to g4, which explains black's next move, queen h4. Looks very aggressive. In fact, it's a defensive move to prevent that move, queen g4, from winning outright. Sokolov now took time out to capture the d4 pawn. There's 1 pawn up. After rook f to d8, the white attack has been slowed down for the time being, but at the cost of a pawn. And the bishop on b8 is pretty lifeless. White played rook d1, indirect defense of the d4 pawn. Rook c7, knight g3. Now the white attack is willing to resurface in the form of f5. So black lashed out with g5. A very outlandish move indeed. And after queen e3, his position is creaking at the seams. There were some further inaccuracies, but didn't prevent white from going on to win the game in 49 moves. A further example of this plan was from a game from Jakarta from 1994 between 2 Chinamen, Ye Rongwang and Ye Yangjuan. Maybe Smith and Jones sound funny to them. And in this position, black played c takes d4, which is not entirely appropriate with the knight on c6 rather than on b8 from where it can go to d7 later on. White took back with the e pawn, black castled, bishop d3, b6, castles, bishop b7. Well, we already know about the knight d5 manoeuvre, but Ye Rongwang, playing white, did not preempt it by taking off on f6. He played rook e1, and black actually helped him out by playing in this position what is definitely not a bright idea, h6. And we now have transposition into something like the game we just looked at, probably with extra tempo for white. Of course, white took the knight and played knight e4, bishop e7. Well, by analogy, he could now have played knight g3 or queen e2 as build-up moves. He in fact played the bishop straight back to b1 immediately, which I feel is possibly not the most accurate since it gums in the rook on a1. As I say, for example, knight g3, we have what we had before with an extra tempo. Quite a nice middle game for white. Finally, there are simple plans where black plays d5 without c5. Not often seen. Here's a game between two strong grandmasters, Timon and Geller. From Linares, 1983, black played d5, e3, bishop e7, knight d2, early castling, bishop d3, b6, and the familiar knight into e5, bishop b7. Well, you might think, by referring back to some of the games we've seen, that the consequent move now is to play f4. Certainly not bad, but note what Timon did. He took the knight. And the point is that black cannot recapture with a knight from d7, therefore a defensive piece is removed from his king. Play bishop takes f6, and after f4, the same build-up plan of castling, queen h5, rook f3, rook h3 we've seen before, is on the cards. So Geller took drastic measures about it. Rather than sit back and watch the storm clouds gather, he played bishop takes knight himself. Timon took back with the f-pawn. And in view of the pawn structure, white's bishop moving on light squares, so it's black of course, but the pawns fixed for white on the opposite coloured squares to those on which his bishop travels, whereas for black the pawns at e6 and d5 are on the same coloured squares. There's always likely to be a slight superiority for white here, in the endgames as well as the middle games. Queen h4 check he played, trying to be disruptive. g3 of course, queen to h6, queen e2, knight c6, and Timon just castled. And after knight b4 his bishop's gone, but his argument is that it'll be a good knight versus bad bishop type of middle game. He played rook f4, threatening rook h4, and by simply doubling on the f-file, he was left with a strategic superiority, as I say, because of the relative activity of the minor pieces, plus the fact the black queen is a bit strangely placed. So another example of black taking it easy, playing d5, and thinking this silly amateurish opening is going to cause him no problems, and in fact he was beaten rather quickly. Finally, there's a game from the 1984 World Junior Championship between Gallego and Al-Othman. Not two all that well-known players. d5 played black, e3, bishop e7, knight d2, this time b6 rather than castling. Bishop d3, bishop b7, and once again this move bishop takes f6. Black recaptures, c3. Castles, and now a most noteworthy move. h4, once again going for a kingside attack. Knight d7, knight g5. Note that the move bishop takes g5 here is losing immediately to the reply bishop takes h7 check. Black saw that and played g6, and white carried on building up in primitive but very effective manner with queen g4. h5 boots the queen away, but is of course a serious weakening. Queen g3, bishop takes g5, took back with the pawn of course. c5, once again you see white castling queenside in the Torre attack. a5. Black is getting something by way of a counter demonstration going here, but in view of the fact that once again it's a bad bishop situation for him, white can, if he wants to, play f2 to f4 and fix the pawn structure very badly from black's point of view, he's likely to be worse in the endgames as well as the middle games. The Torre attack is a pin. One of the simplest ways of dealing with a pin is to put the question to the bishop. In this case with the move 3h6, which is the next section we're going to be looking at. By analogy with the Ruy Lopez, the Spanish opening, you play 3a6 there very often. And again by comparison, white can either retreat, bishop to a4, or take on c6, doubling the black pawns. Here there's the same dichotomy. You can retreat the bishop to h4, which I'm not going to be recommending, or take on f6. Now by taking on f6 here, if we continue the comparison, there'll be no damage to the black pawn structure because he recaptures with the queen. My intention then is to advocate a system where you follow up rapidly with e4, knight c3, queen d2, and maybe castle queenside. I advocated this system in the video on the Trompovsky. Since then there have been some recent games, including one in the World Championship match, which seem to support the idea that it is quite a good way of playing for white. So 3h6. As I say, I'm now recommending we capture this knight. Black takes back with the queen, and then e4, reaching a position sometimes arrived at from the Trompovsky opening. It actually occurred in the 1993 World Championship match, Timon playing white against Karpov, the FIDE World Championship match that is. Most of us were more interested in what was going on in London at the time. And after d6, knight to c3, Karpov played what is a quasi-novelty. He played g5. Far more often black plays g6 or setups involving playing on the dark squares here. I suppose Karpov could argue he is playing on the dark squares. He's also been quite provocative though in advancing the pawn 2 squares, not 1. Timon took up the challenge with e5, queen to e7, and now he played bishop to b5 check. Personally, I found Daniel King's treatment of this position when he had it against the Swiss player Sumermatter in Luzern in 1989 more interesting. He played h4 immediately, forcing a crisis. Black played g4 and now knight d2. Black played h5 and King chose f4. And I think black was now mistaken to take this pawn en passant. Probably the correct move is to play d5. With quite a strategically complex position, white has more space, but he's given up his dark squared bishop. And the question also arises as to what the future of this knight on d2 is going to be. Maybe it goes to b3, I'm not certain. Maybe white breaks with f5 in this position immediately. At any rate, I think it would have been better to have played that than what Sumermatter actually did. He played g takes f3 en passant. King took back with a knight. Knight c6 was played. And in this middle game that's arising, the weakness to the black king side is certainly something of a headache. Then he played bishop b5, bishop d7, queen e2, intending to castle and use the f-file. Black took on e5. Interesting interpolation now, he took on c6. Black took back with the bishop, of course. Knight takes e5. And with pressure down the f-file, plus the immediate threat of busting up the black pawns on c6, I think white is already better. In fact, the game continued with queen b4. Bishop d7 was a better move. Castle's queenside. Black played bishop g7, and rather than contenting himself with denting the black pawn structure with knight takes c6, we see quite an uncharacteristic move from Grandmaster King. He played knight takes f7. Excellent attacking opportunity. King takes f7. From h to f1 check. If now king e7, d5, and the attack carries on. Black tried bishop f6. Became d5 anyway. E takes d5, and now a nice attack. Rook takes f6 check. And black gave it all up, because if king takes f6, rook f1 check, followed by the rapid introduction of the white queen on e6 or e5, leads to a total debacle. I do feel this move 8h4 as played here is the critical test of Karpov's idea. As play actually went in the World Championship game, black equalised and possibly rather more than equalised. Let's have a look at what actually happened there. Timon played 8 bishop to b5 check. Karpov interposed with the bishop. Now he castled, a radically different interpretation from King's. d5 played Karpov. Now bishop came back to d3. Knight c6. Knight to b5. Only a temporary post. Black castled queenside, consistent with the move 6g5. Timon fixed the central pawn structure with 12c3, and after h5, a4, king b8, b4, we had a standard opposite sides castling middle game, with hell for leather attacks likely to break out. Bishop g7 played Anatoly, completing his development, and the retreat knight a3 is obviously so that the B and A pawns can now advance with some effect. You can really stop the analysis of the opening hereabouts. I think black has at least equalised. His own initiative on the king's side is just as effective as white's on the opposite side of the board. In fact, the game was drawn in 47 moves. I had this position against candidate Grandmaster Chris Ward in a tournament in 1990. He played not Karpov's provocative g5 from the World Championship match, but more restrained knight d7. After queen d2, c6, castle queenside, e5. Both king b1 and h4 have been played. I took on e5, which is also not a new move. And taking back with the pawn is not possible here because of the reply knight to b5 with favourable complications, which are not too hard to follow and are indeed discussed in Julian Hodgson's video on the Trompowsky. Krista back with a knight. I took it off. Knight d4 was a possibility there, but this is more interesting, I think. And he has to take with the queen, because once again taking back with the pawn doesn't really work because of knight b5 with embarrassment. After queen takes e5, we reach a very interesting middle game after f4, queen a5, bishop to c4, bishop e7, king b1, that's a good idea usually when you castle queenside, b5, bishop b3, queen b6, clearly black has a lot of chances on the queen side. White has it on the other side of the board. Rook hf1, castles, e5. And black is not anxious to open up the path for the bishop towards f7, so he closed it with d5. Now queen d3, the idea of course being to play f5 and f6. So black gets moving on the other side of the board, b4, knight e2, a5. And the only way to hold up this advance is to play the somewhat strange looking move bishop a4. It's not so daft though, it stops the queenside advance for the moment. Bishop a6 with tempo, queen to f3, once again white's now ready to play f5 to f6. So black played f6. There's now e6, then there'll be counterplay for black based on bishop b5 perhaps, or rook d8 following c5 later on. And if we take on f6, then obviously black takes back with the bishop with an excellent position. Well, at this point I produced rather a nice idea. I played knight d4, which really galvanises the white pieces. Black took on f1. Now the point is not to take it back, but to play knight takes c6 with attacks on both bishops and the d5 pawn. And after bishop c5 as played, rook takes f1. No need to take the d pawn, it's not going anywhere. King h8, once again, is nothing more constructive. Queen takes d5, and black has some problems here. White has two full pawns for the exchange and a dominating position and a passed e-pawn, and is doing very well indeed. And in fact, later on I actually rather sadly blundered and lost this game, but so far it's certainly a complete vindication of White's treatment, and an interesting addition to the theory of this plan of knight c3, queen d2, e4 and castling queenside. A less frequently seen plan for black, and in my opinion probably not so good, is to try now to fianchetto the queen's bishop immediately, without bothering to contest the central dark squares or the king side. b6. After bishop d3, bishop b7, I believe the consistent move with the plan we're talking about, knight c3, is quite a good one here. Possibly even better though is to put the knight on d2. We'll come back to knight c3 in a moment. Look at knight d2 in this position. In the game Korchnoi-Karpov, Hastings 1971, black played d6, then queen e2, and then the mysterious move a6. The idea is to stop a bishop coming in over there, weakening his light squares. Castles queenside. Knight d7. And the rest of the game is really a triumph for the canny Korchnoi against the up-and-coming Karpov. King b1, like Victor. e5, played Anatoly to prevent the possibility of an irritating e5 from white after black plays bishop e7. c3, strengthening the middle, bishop e7, knight c4, knight comes towards the nice square on e3. Castles, bishop c2, rook f8, d5. And Karpov chose to close the centre completely with c5 after knight e3, bishop f8, g4. We see the beginnings of an attack for white. Queen d8, g5, White isn't worried about losing a pawn if he can open up lines against the black king. h5, g6. Consistent with my previous comment, actually. Korchnoi developed an attack, went on to win a very nice game indeed. 12 years later, the diagram position arose again in a game between Lerner and Udasin from the Soviet Union, and black retreated with queen d8. After queen e2, black does have some problems drumming up adequate counterplay here. He played bishop e7. Once again, white castle queenside. The idea of playing as aggressively as possible. Now came d6, probably 3 or 4 moves later than his best. h4. Again, this cryptic move a6 to keep the bishop out, whilst black is waiting and crouching. Knight c4, knight d7, knight e3, a familiar manoeuvre from the last game. Knight f6, clearly if black were to castle, then g4, g5 would come very quickly, opening up lines. So knight f6, and once again very aggressive, e5. Knight to d5, Lerner took it. Bishop takes on d5. White now got the initiative by playing bishop to e4. It's been suggested perhaps even better was to have played c4. And if, for example, the bishop retreats, carry on playing aggressively with d5, e takes d5, e6. As I remarked earlier, the development of the knight to c3 has been seen here as well, which is also quite challenging. It was a very interesting game indeed between Boris Spassky and Tony Miles from a tournament in Borgogno in 1983, where black did indeed equalise with some extremely vigorous and accurate play. He played bishop b4, which I think is the best move here. White castled, black took off the knight on c3, and then played d6. To show you how accurately Miles was playing, castles is really a weaker move, because after knight d2, the point of that is to advance the f-pawn, white can get an attack going quite nicely. For example, the game Klinger Sumamata, also from Lucerne 1989. We've seen Danny King beating him there. After d6, f4, knight d7, queen to g4. It's really quite automatic and easy to build up an attack here with white. Black played queen e7. And after 13 rook a to e1, the white attack is building up very fearsomely indeed. Black played rook e8, the game e5, and with manoeuvres like rook e3 to g3, for example, in the air, it's easy to see how dangerous this white attack can become. The spectre of that was probably what lured Sumamata to play f5. White took en passant. Black took back with a knight. Clearly this diagonal from d3 to h7 is now looking very nasty indeed. White played queen g3, and the attack was triumphant later on. In Spassky Miles, Spassky too freed the way for the advance of the f-pawn with knight d2. After e5, he played in characteristically cavalier manner, especially from his younger days, with f4. The point is, if black now takes the d-pawn, then white will carry on with e5. A sacrifice which can't be taken, but after, for example, d takes e5, f takes e5. If queen to g5, then knight f3. The initiative keeps going. The cost of 1 or maybe even 2 pawns. Very characteristic of the youthful Boris Spassky. So Miles correctly took the f-pawn. He takes f4. I played g3. I'm exploiting this pin, so black had to play g5. Now Spassky played a4. Maybe queen f3 was a better move there. It's difficult to analyse and annotate with certainty. What we can say is that a middle game with opposite sides casting is about to develop, and a big initiative for both sides. Very, very sharp. Knight c6. Queen e2. Castle's queenside. Well, as you can see, an extremely complicated middle game has developed with chances for both sides. It, in fact, eventually resulted in a draw, the contest reflecting great credit on both players. Miles played very accurately after knight c3, with bishop b4 taking on c3 and then d6. I think what it probably says is that a better plan against this particular setup of blacks, of b6 and bishop b7, is to play knight d2 and c3, as did Korchnoi and Lerner. Well, that just about wraps up our survey of the Torre attack. Hope the video showed you some interesting games and also served to make clearer some of the strategical themes. Since its introduction in 1925, it's always been regarded as a simple method of developing a sound position while sidestepping mainline theory, and that still remains the verdict today.